So, very happy to have Astrid here. Astrid's a kind of artist and designer and technologist and researcher whose work is highly relevant for us at this kind of a network. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work. So she was the Bella co-founder and works with Bella team still to this day. Bella, I'm sure, is also familiar to many of you, but this embedded hardware that's become a real essential tool for doing any kind of embedded audio work with sort of good quality, good low latency work. She was a music technology researcher and creative producer at Ableton, has a PhD from Queen Mary University of London, and has been involved in many of the kind of high level discussions around new instruments and design, the CHIME community, and these kind of things. So we're very happy to have you here, Astrid. I'll pass over to you if you're good to go.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen and hope that everything works the way it should. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's always nice to be among people who are interested in the same nerdy things you are. So thanks very much, Tom, for inviting me. And today I'm going to talk about a project that I did in the last couple of years on Star Trek instruments. And how I used science fiction to explore design. As Tom said, I was formerly about a month ago, I would have said this. I work in R&D for a music software company, making interfaces for music and researching, but blah, blah, blah. That didn't happen. Well, it did happen for 4 years. And then something that rhymes with layoff happened. So now I'm having an identity crisis. So that's always fun. So what I've realized is that at the root of my work, I love complicated things. I love complex workflows and design for human creativity and culturally rooted behaviors and understanding error. I wrote a whole PhD about that. But mostly it's about this idea of taking the computer and somehow incorporating it into complicated human affairs. So this talk is about my adventures with Star Trek instruments and how I applied that to digital musical instrument design. And this talk's in 4 parts. First, I talk about Star Trek instruments. What are they, etc. Also, what I found out about one in particular, how I built it, and some stuff that I learned. So the background is that once you're oriented in the direction of musical instruments, you start to see them everywhere. And you sure do. They're all over science fiction, all over the place, not just Star Trek. They're in Star Wars. Even ridiculous ones show up every once in a while. But in March 2020, we all know where we were. And I was on my sofa watching Star Trek because I said to my partner, we're going to need something with a lot of episodes that's not too depressing, that's kind of fun to watch, because we might be here for a whole month. Which is adorable to say now, but that's what happens. So that's how I ended up watching all of Star Trek. And we started from the beginning, and that just went from there. And what I noticed in Star Trek, went on for a long time. There was a lot of evolution of science fiction and the way that we think about science fiction during the many, many decades that Star Trek was on. And I started to notice, and I started to track all the instruments in it, because there's an astonishing amount of instruments in Star Trek, musical instruments. And I started to notice that they were not just musical instruments. They were serving some really important plot points. One of those was that music equals intelligence. Musical instruments are used to signify that a human being is intelligent and not just a scientist, but well-rounded. Also, can play these weird 20th century instruments that surely in 500 years nobody's going to care about anymore. But we've all seen that. Also, music is used to symbolize humanity. A good example is Mr. Data, who was a robot, and through his series, TNG, he learns to play the violin because he tries to do all these things to access humanity. So musical instruments were used as a way of symbolizing that he was accessing humanity. They also show futuristic human culture. This is an amazing episode where Picard is in like a cafe in a futuristic Paris, and he looks out to the Eiffel Tower, and there's a hyperloop running underneath it. And there's this guy in the background playing this, which sounds just like an accordion, but I don't know, future or something. And It's wild. And I mean, I believe it's season 1, episode 24. Do check it out because it's a great scene. But what I find interesting about this is that the sound of the instrument has not evolved at all, just its form, and it's now got like a car vent on the front, and you play it by raising these glass rings along these glass tubes. Hilarious. There's also this way that they use instruments to symbolize that aliens are just like us, that they have culture, that they have complexity, that they have art, that they have, they're not just like killing machines. They have a society. And there's a whole bunch of really good examples of this. This is Star Trek's best bit player, Mr. Hom, playing a Betazoid chime, which is really, really loud. And the great thing about these instruments, it doesn't matter how they work. That was not part of what anybody was doing when designing these instruments. They didn't work. They just put some really questionable sound design on it. So how does that little tiny glass thing resonate to a degree where it's incredibly loud? Nobody knows. It doesn't matter. There's also this one. I believe it's the Algolian musical instrument. And it's this guy who's playing in a bar, and he's playing these like long hanging sort of chains of bones. How those are resonant, who knows? It doesn't matter. So there's absolutely no regard with these instruments for how they might have worked. There's also this thing was a telepathic instrument. This one's in Voyager. And this telepathic guy is like waving his hand over it and playing it why you need to play it. Why you need to wave your hand over it when you're playing it telepathically? Who knows? How is it making sound? Doesn't matter. They just put some sound design over it. And there was one instrument that really grabbed me. In all of these instruments, that they're constantly just the whole point was that it's a prop and it looks like something and it sounds like something, I guess. But there was one instrument like stood apart, and that is the Aldean instrument. And this is an unnamed instrument from season 1, episode 16. And the whole plot is that the children of the Enterprise are kidnapped. And they're by this race of people who can't reproduce. Spoiler, it was an environmental toxin. They're fine now. But the children are all distributed among these different families. And this little girl is sent to this family of musicians. Great. And so she's learning to play this instrument. It's in her lap. And I was totally I couldn't get over this thing. It looked so cool. The sound design was a bit meh, but all the sound design in this era of Star Trek was a bit meh. But I just thought, what an amazing instrument. Never seen anything like that before. And it just grabbed me for several reasons. First of all, it looks super cool. I just couldn't get over it. Like, how would you even build that? Secondly, it's on camera for about 4 seconds. And what better way is there to grab somebody's imagination than that? You also play it by, it lets you read it. You let it read your moods. And what she did was she kind of put her hand on it, and it started, when you were sufficiently relaxed, it would start playing these twinkly tunes. And at one point she dropped it, and it made this horrible noise. So what is that? How would I even do that? And also the other thing, that there was a design credit. It's the only one that there's a design credit. And it's this guy. This guy's called Andrew Probert. And you probably haven't heard of him, but you've definitely seen his work. He's designed everything that anybody's cared about in science fiction in the last 40 years. He designed the bridge for Star Trek. He designed the DeLorean and Back to the Future. His website's amazing. I really recommend checking out his work. But anyway, he's still working. So I sent him an email and I said, what do you remember about this instrument? Because I know that you designed it, and I'm a musical instrument researcher, and I'd like to know. And he said, I don't remember anything, but I did look up in my archives, I have a sketch of my original production sketch, and here it is. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Couldn't get over it. It was so beautiful. So that was it. I had to build it. And so I noticed that when I start to build an instrument, no matter, and I mean, I've been at this a long time, and both design and this kind of design for a long time. And I always find myself kind of being shepherded by what are the affordances of the technology that I have available, despite my best intentions. So I thought this is a good opportunity to just scratch that. And how do I achieve the vibe of what the designer intended? That's a whole different thing. And these instruments are all about vibe. They are these storytelling props that, I don't know, sound like something, but if I made it work, what would that mean? So I come to the next part, which is how I built it. So the goal of this was to build this instrument that reflects the player's mood, but looks like the original design. And when I describe this I mean, this is over a number of months. It was the pandemic. Nobody was doing anything. But when I described this to people, people were like, well, how are you going to make it read someone's mind? And I was like, huh, that's a good point. And then I thought, actually, no, that's not what I'm doing at all. What I'm doing is I'm trying to get it to read it said that it reads moods. And I was like, surely there's a lot of ways to do that. And then I did a spoiler because I advanced the slide too early, but I'll tell you the story. I'm not on social media very much, but someone texted me on Instagram. So I went to Instagram in the browser of my phone. I don't install those apps. Why would you do that? And while I was writing this message back to somebody, I dropped my phone on the sofa. And the phone, I picked it back up and it had this error message: rage shake. Want to report a bug? Don't forget to take a screenshot. I couldn't get over that. I was like, wow, Instagram thinks I'm doing this when I don't know, when I drop my phone, it's inferring all these emotions. That maybe that's a little bit true, but I was like, okay, there's a lot of ways to kind of infer. This isn't as simple, as straightforward as just like make it read your mind. There's a whole bunch of things that we could be doing here. So then I got onto the idea of effective computing. And effective computing is the brainchild of this amazing woman who worked for a long time in this area. And her name is Rosalind Picard. Blew my mind. So she says that effective computing is computing that relates to, arises from, or deliberately influences emotions. And there's a lot of research about effective computing, and it kind of has these two intersecting axes. One is unpleasant to pleasant, and that's called valence. And then there's this other intersecting axis, which is active to inactive, and that's called arousal. And then there's been a lot of research about how to place particular emotional states around this. And I was like, oh, geez, is this what I'm doing? And then I realized, no, what I'm doing is much simpler. I've got how hard it's being gripped, because you have the hand grip at the front of the instrument. So that's one place I can get some sort of activation metric. And there's also how much it's moving around. And I can sort of make that pleasantness or unpleasantness, because in the show, she drops it and it makes this horrible noise. So then I got to work. I used Abella, which is an embedded music, audio and sensor processing platform. And with that, I used this accelerometer in order to sense how much it's moving around. And with that, I used a trill bar, which is a capacitive touch sensor that can sense multi-touch. And I could sense how many fingers were on the grip and how hard were they gripping, because it can sense touch size or how hard you're pressing down. So with those two axes, then I had something all right. I have a system that I can sort of, manipulate with these two interactions. So to make it, I made it on a laser cutter, because that's how I prototype everything, with many layers of sandwiched together paper. So I cut this out on a laser cutter and gave it lights and kind of assembled it. And then it was this. So what you do is, you, just like in the show, you put your hand over the edge and you lay the sound design for this was very, very simple. It was just 4 parts of a major chord with some twinkly sounds. So I recreated that. I've since got a little more interesting with it, but I'll show you what the original was. And so when you put your fingers on the sensor, each finger that you lay on the sensor activates one part of that chord. And as you grip it, it will make it more, it will increase the amplitude. And if you move it around too much, it makes some horrible noise and turns itself off. So let me show you a video. So that was all it was. And that managed to, I hope you could hear that. I hope I shared that. Good, I shared the sound correctly, thank goodness. But what I found was that this was a completely inverted way of looking at instrument design, because usually you're like, I've got these sorts of, thank you. I've got these sorts of little, these sorts of sensors, maybe I can, and you sort of put them together. But I found that having to lead from this storytelling perspective and being true to, I mean, I recreated the sound design just in live. It was no big deal, but recreating the interaction to follow along that storytelling thing of like, okay, you when you calm yourself down, you put your hands on it, it does this. If you get too excited, it does that. And there was some really interesting outcomes. It's not chaotic, but it is sensitive. And I found myself having to take the time to master it, like really had to learn to play it. It's also very responsive to touch and low latency and motion. Thank you, low latency. This is the beauty of a low latency system. And the other thing is I keep going back to it. I've created other like sound designs for it and other ways of interaction. So there was a few outcomes for it. And the cool thing, number one, was working backwards from a place where technology is not the most important element or not even an element at all was very enlightening. So I realized how much, despite my best knowledge and intentions, I was still being led. I was still going back to the, well, what do I have around instead of what's the mood I'm trying to create? And that was a really important lesson. It also was interesting to think about what an instrument does and what it means and extracting how it works from there. So it wasn't about coming up with this sensing system. It was about, okay, if I'm going to create that mood and that interaction, then what do I have to do sensor wise? It was also an interesting way to think about what a DMI sounds like, because as we all know, when you're creating a DMI, it can sound like anything you can imagine. So how do you root yourself in something? And this was, I mean, I just rooted myself to the, very basic sound design in the TV show. But this was it's really like opened up this whole world of like, what could it sound like? What would it sound like? Because it's all rooted in this interaction and this kind of vibe, I think. Like, okay, you have to be calm and you have to quiet yourself down. And what does that mean? And what kind of sounds would come from something like that? Like, what makes sense? And the eternal truism is watching Star Trek is never a waste of time. So that's all I got. Thank you. Without these people, none of this project would have been possible. And thanks very much, Tom and Simon, for inviting me.
Amazing. Thanks, Astrid. That's really it's a really kind of juicy topic in so many ways. I think for me particularly, because it's the total opposite of the way I would normally approach doing something like this. And I find that really interesting. My instinct is to be, okay, what's around me? What can I do with technology? Okay, I'll work with that in some way. But anyway, I should open the floor to questions and see what people want to ask you in relation to this. I think we still have 10 minutes potentially. So you can either put your hand up and then come on with microphone and camera, or if you prefer, post in the chat and I can read questions out from there. Hands up via the reactions button at the bottom. I think that should be there somewhere. Or post in chat. While people are thinking about that. Oh, well, no, I didn't get in fast enough. Okay, Nick, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Yeah, quick with the questions. Thanks, Astrid, for a great talk. I loved that talk. That was very good, fun. And I had a question, which is, looking at Star Trek, you looked at, I guess, the old Star Trek, where all the things they made were physical, right? So even if they were creating a crazy music, I think this kind of approach would be different, like in modern, let's say modern movies where they use CGI things and everything's just made up in VR and you don't actually have to physically make the imagined instrument, if that makes sense.
So what's the question? Is it
is there any difference if in the TV show that you're getting inspiration from, rather than them having to physically make the instrument, which they did in the early Star Treks, the new ones, they just do some sort of CGI 3D model thing, and doesn't even have to be physically possible. That removal of the physical in the imagining. Do you think that will change this sort of source of inspiration?
I don't know. I went through all of Star Trek. And it's not just like the early stuff is mostly like Vulcan folk jams. So it's much more, but even so, that has all kinds of interesting suggestions of what Vulcan culture is like and etc. I know not everybody is a super nerd, so I'm going to keep it light on the Star Trek deep dives. But I think that one thing that really frustrates me about modern Star Trek and a lot of modern science fiction is this idea that there's a lot of like spaceship driving interfaces where you put your hands up and you just go in like this in the air, which would be horrible and incredibly painful after about 15 minutes. It's like it's ridiculous. And so I find that these kinds of ideas of you know, these virtual interfaces, I don't find them necessarily that credible. And if they were to CGI something like super cool, well, yeah, I mean, if it's interesting enough, they take a crack at building it. Why not? That's even an interesting thing is, you know, okay, it's only available in virtual space, but what does that mean to bring it into actual space? So I think that all of these are really interesting suggestions, and I think that bringing anything into the real world is a completely different process than thinking about it or prototyping it or digitally doing something with it. I think it's just a completely different design process.
Okay, thanks, Astrid.
There were other hands up a minute ago. Are they still valid hands? They've been retracted. Simon's hand is literally up physically. But you're muted.
Okay, so assuming sound is working okay. So I really liked the different starting point and the different framing, which are obviously super relevant for Star Trek. But I get the strong feeling that that different framing is much more widely applicable and is kind of generalizable. It feels to me like there's the germ of a sort of wider and deeper, interesting way of thinking about instrument design. So it's not really a sort of comment. It's not really a question. It's kind of a suspicion, I suppose, an invitation for rumination or something.
Yeah, thanks. I'll ruminate.
Did you want to ruminate publicly now, or shall we pass on to Peter?
I don't know. I didn't want to hold anybody up. I think that I do think that this is. I'd never thought of doing this before for some reason. I mean, all the Star Trek I've watched in my life, I'd never thought of like taking an imaginary instrument and like actually trying to make it work. There's a lot of people who do recreations of objects in movies and stuff like that, but having to make it functional was like a completely different DMI sort of process. Because of course, like, you know, we have all of these tools and all of this knowledge and all of these techniques at our fingertips, but that process was really, really useful. And I think it applies in a lot of places. I think you're right, Simon. And yeah, I should find something else cool to do.
So Peter, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, thanks Astrid for the really inspiring talk. Just really great work. Really simple question: what instrument next? Do you have another one lined up that you're planning to develop?
I don't know. I would like to. I'd actually would like to redo the one that I prototyped, because it's traveled a lot now and it's really falling apart. And I would like to actually 3D print parts of it and, you know, make it robust and not as prototypey, because it was made in about a week. But yeah, I mean that it's sort of interesting, because it's kind of instructive to me about what quality design is, because this idea that Andrew Probert had for this instrument is he's a great designer. He's an amazing designer, and I keep going back to it. There's always new things. There's new things in his imagining of it. There's new things in the materiality of it. I feel like I could just make this one again and again.
Thanks.
JP, your hand's back up.
Yep. Thank you, Astrid. The very, very inspiring talk. And that's probably one of the things that I liked the most out of it was this reflection on as a very important source of inspiration for you, right? Like finding inspiration in some places that helps you building an instrument. So I'm wondering if there are what are other sources of inspiration for you, other media, other movies, or series, or anything else. I'm just curious to learn more about that.
I think that, and this is why, I mean, I keep going back to hardware. My first 2 degrees were in sculpture. So I have a real affinity with and attachment to the material world. So I love materials and I love building things and I love a challenge. Like a lot of the instruments I build are round because it's hard. And like it's difficult to like make curves. It's difficult to make things I also really like percussion instruments for that reason. It's difficult to make things resonant. And so I think that where I find I get excited about making things is really in materials. And especially when all you need to do is take a piezo sensor and start putting it underneath different materials. And there's a whole universe of things that you can do and respond in like real world responses that don't require really any fancy software. There's, you know, there's all kinds of natural filtering that can happen with the like natural properties of materials. So I find materials really exciting. So anytime I find like, you know, a cool piece of rubber or like something new I can shove in a laser cutter, that's exciting. Of course, like, you know, if I see something in a movie or like, I don't know, somebody comes up with something and I'm like, that looks cool, that's nice too. But really, I'm always excited about materials.
Time for 1 or 2 other quick questions, if there are any. Like I say, also feel free to post in the chat if that's easier. And or we may have time for the wider discussion to pick up on any of these kind of strands at the end. Well, yeah, thanks again, Astrid. That was really, really engaging and interesting.
Thank you.
And just quite liberating to take seriously, you know, the design in fictional spaces, and yeah, like quite inspiring. But yeah, okay, so I'll pass over to my colleague Simon Holland to introduce Thor in the second talk.